Would anyone like to make any observations or ask anything at this point?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Kristen. Very good, very helpful. I actually did a dissertation for my master's on vulnerability, about taking off the mask, which very much relates to this, in the sense of keeping our focus on God's perspective of us rather than other people, and that we put on a mask, or what we sort of or don't attribute honor to other people where it's deserved, that sort of thing, in order for people to think better of us. And what's behind that, and what's behind it, is our caring too much what other people think, over and above what God thinks. And I found it extremely interesting to study. And obviously the Pharisees are key key in all of that, to sort of see how Jesus how Jesus responded to them.
No, well, and I think that's part of what I wanted to get across is at the beginning when Jesus is saying you still need to kind of try and honor what they're doing, try and honor the things they're highlighting to you. And as I've looked at these things more and more, because on that mask situation, there's a verse in John which is where it says, Jesus Jesus wasn't entrusting himself to everybody because he knew what was in people. So what that tells you is there is a degree to which in our broken world we have to have a bit of a gap between the presenting person and the real person themselves. So there is a bit of a now in ideal world you want to find people that you can drop the mask with as much as possible. But that won't be everybody.
No, as you say, Jesus demonstrated that in the way he responded to like the questions we've looked at, and
exactly,
So all of that. He wasn't.
Yeah, and so this is what I'm saying is this regular tension, and I think there's something here of the same thing, which is the reality is we all need to have status recognition in some way or other for mental well-being. Now, when you're a child with a parent, hopefully if you've got good parents, they're giving you plenty of status and that's all going well. As you get older, the natural choice is you either take it by dominance or you have it by what I use the word prestige for, things that I know that people value and I can do them. The third option, though, is something that is outside of our control. It's the community around us. And actually when people who naturally have, if you like, prestige because they're good at something, actually acknowledge something that's come from you, encourage you, speak to you, I also get it from that. And so there is something very much about how we have to have a culture to go back to where you started, Barbara. I don't think it's possible for us not to feel the temptations into the things that Jesus is addressing here. There is a need for emergence of structure. Structure becomes less personal, and we need that very often. The more anointed something is, and the more it grows, the more structure it needs around it. And so we need to go through that process, which inevitably means now there is some status that comes with the position. And very slowly it can kind of creep in where there is less to do with anointing, more to do with competence. As that happens, then we now feel threatened if people challenge us because we're not quite competent. So now we take our status by dominance. Well, I'm in this position, I can make the decision, I'll do it. And things very subtly, almost over time, it's almost the natural evolution of things. And therefore, I suspect that a healthy spiritual environment is one where there is regularly old dead roots that are now new things kind of growing in the roots of things, falling off them and starting new things. It's almost the natural way in keeping the life alive, if I can put it that way. But we see it in the big ways, and the more historic a denomination is, and the more baggage it has, and the more status it often has with it. We can kind of look at it, and it's easy to be critical of, but actually we don't want to get too quick into that habit, because we'll just very quickly repeat the same thing. You know, and the issues of titles, I just think is so funny, because I think it doesn't matter what we avoid the ones Jesus says, like rabbi, but then we do, you know, as I said, I use Pentecostalism where they use the word father a lot, but equally it could have been Catholicism, both those places. It's a very honoring thing, and it is a natural function, even a spiritual function. But once we start to get the status from the function rather than actually the process and the responsibility to be those things, is where it kind of goes wrong.
Yes, it's like we need to give honor to one another, but not receive it, sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly. I think a huge amount of the problems we face often as a church is that we hear things that are given to us as a responsibility to respond to, and we apply those to others. So take Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. We can go around looking to employ that as a kind of as a church membership status. So in our church, does everybody live up to the sexual standards that Jesus sets out there? No, they don't. So chuck them out. Yeah. Do they live up to the way they talk about each other and the way they don't run each other? No, there are people in that. There are people in the church I know, churches I know, that don't always do that. So we chuck them out. But then we've got it the wrong way around. It's actually it's spoken to us to encourage us to live up to a standard. Yeah. And what we've done is turned it around and used it to logically apply.
Grace is so important in all this. So
it's that knowing who the audience is for each verse. You have to remember what is the audience here. Yes. So you're absolutely right. We do want to give honor, but we don't necessarily. We will notice when we're in a culture where actually honor is required, and honor is required by meeting certain standards, which are a bit arbitrary. You know? Yes.
I was also thinking about what Jesus said in John about how can you receive, glory from God when you are sort of caught up with receiving glory from one another. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I'm not sure.
I haven't quoted that quite right. But it's in John about you can't receive the glory from God because you're.
He talks, doesn't he, in several places about you have your reward in full.
Yes.
Which is to do with presenting yourself, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
It may be something else that you're driving at there, Barbara.
I'll see if I can find it. But it's about not receiving glory from one another. That's the words.
It's the glory, yeah.
And I think it's what's in your heart, isn't it? You know, that's always the key. And if you're looking for glory from one another, you're not going to receive that sense of God's approval because you're looking in the wrong place. I've sort of battled with some of this because I love to dance in worship, and that has been for me a real switching off from what will people think of me and all of that stuff, and think actually what's God what does God want and just try and shut out other people. And I found that has actually helped me then in other areas of life to think, well, okay, I can do that and look good, but actually what does God want?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, is this the verse you meant? John 7 verse 18. Well, starting the verse, before anyone desires to do his will, he will know about the teaching, whether it's from God or if I'm speaking from myself. He who speaks for himself seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true. No unrighteousness is in him. I was just looking for the word glory in John. Was that the one? Not quite the thing, is it?
It wasn't quite what I had. No, I'll just go and
see if you can find it. Yeah.
Well, yes, interesting what you're saying about where he said to do as they say, and the temple tax, and I suppose it raised the question of church leadership if they have certain expectations. I mean, obviously everyone's imperfect anyway, so and it's not quite where you're at, but I suppose the question is, do you compromise and go along with it just to keep the unity, etc.?
Yeah.
Or do you do your own thing if it's a bit whatever, that sort of?
Because I think the balance of the whole passage is there's a choice at some point, so you don't rush to one or the other. We don't rush too quickly to exclude ourselves, because actually there's this process kind of going on, and there is some benefits and so on and so forth. There is it's the nature of anointed leadership. It talks about a righteous person leaves an inheritance to their children's children. And in many ways, if you like, the anointing of John Wesley leaves an inheritance to children's children's children. People get the benefits from the Methodist Church that he's left behind. So there is almost a spiritual principle in which that legacy is good, and we don't want to throw it all away too quickly. But at the same time, as we recognize when it starts to get impositional and people now claiming too much hierarchy and so on, there is a place to start working out, okay, how do I honorably step out of this and go somewhere else to reflect the truth that's no longer working. So it's not a yes or no answer. It's about, we have to balance the choices and the decision within a real process.
Yes, so yeah,
mate.
Not just jumping to I think you're wrong.
Yeah,
actually, but sort of give it time to work out and see where you stand. Yeah.
No, and as I said, I do think that we should understand that commission to Jesus through Peter, and therefore to church leadership, of the ability to bind and loose, which is, we can never understand fully the pressure that someone sitting in a leadership position may have in trying to make a choice. To give an example where I was on the wrong side of as a member, looking at someone who I thought ought to be leading and was agitating for this person to get more responsibility. And then as I myself grew in my understanding, I started to discover issues about the person, which of course the leadership had always been fully aware of, but for the sake of grace and not killing and destroying the person reputation, they had been working with them, trying to manage certain things in place. And so you start to realize that very often when you're on the outside working out, the answers look easy. When you are in that leadership position, you often have to make a choice, which is not perfect, but you have to make the choice. And so I recognize, therefore, it's always easier when you're not already carrying the responsibility to come up with what you think is the right answer.
Yeah,
because there'll be stuff that you're just not aware of, perspectives you haven't seen. It doesn't necessarily mean that the leaders are always right, but there is a kind of a grace given to them to have to make those choices. And I think an awful lot of those, if you look at how denominations historically have had very different views on quite big issues, you see there is a grace from God to allow things that he needn't have disallowed, but because that worked for a certain layer of leadership culture. And there is something very, very powerful in that little statement that I used some years back now, but I've seen it be rotating, being used a few times elsewhere, which was, that John the Baptist had a monopoly, Jesus had a franchise. But what do we mean by Jesus had a franchise? Which is, Jesus actually gave away a large amount of the authority that he naturally had to those who followed after him, to reinterpret, redo, work it out for themselves, rather than kind of having a dictatorship through the millennia. So I even when I encounter things that I'm not so happy with in leadership structures, I recognize that, first of all, there are things that they can see that I can't. Two, I recognize that actually there is an inevitability to having to make imperfect decisions very often as a leader, because you have to. Sorry, we're about to go off on a big tangent now, because I'm going to start talking about politics. But actually, the problem we have with the politics that wants to accommodate everybody is that you don't get enough unity for actually it to be good for people generally. So actually, what you end up with is a politics that's no good for anybody. Because it's trying to accommodate too many folks. the better solution, but you don't want to become dictatorial in it. The best solution is to kind of set some lines in place and say, now everybody needs to try and work within those lines. And some will just be rebellious and won't, but actually for the majority that do, it does far better and they get lifted far more. So I think it's a part of the nature of our limited leadership, which sometimes it's better to have a simple policy that people can get their head around than to have every nuance tried to be reflected in the, maybe it doesn't work here and therefore we shouldn't make it there, and maybe we should not say it because that might exclude that person even though they didn't deserve to be. We can get so into that we end up not making any choices structurally, and end up with something that doesn't actually lift anybody. So and that's true of church, it's true of national politics and so on. So
I found the verse of it.
Go on then, Barbara.
But it's in the NIV, it's praise. So I'm looking up the wrong thing and leading you astray. It's praise in the NIV, not
right.
So it's John 5:41 to 44. I do not accept praise from men, but I know you. I know that you do not have the love of God in your hearts. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me. But if someone else comes in his own name, you will accept him. How can you believe if you accept praise from one another, yet make no effort to obtain the praise that comes from the only God?
Yeah.
That was the bit I was thinking.
Yeah.
I think in some version it was glory. Anyway,
it is.
But it's praise.
In the web, the World English Bible, it's glory.
Yeah.
So I can see it there. So, and it's probably a more complicated passage than we'll try and do in this answer here.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
the fundamental idea, though, is simply that somehow receiving it from people gets in the way.
Yes.
And
yes, definitely.
And yet, even there is one of these things which you find in the Gospels. When Paul talks about "follow me as I follow Christ," that we have people that help us in those ways. But long term, we don't want them in the way forever and ever. So it's almost like in our immaturity, we need it. So it's not that it's always wrong. It's just that if that becomes the standard that we aspire to, we will never actually be where Jesus wants us to be.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you. That's very good.
Good. Well, why don't we leave it there? So we'll have a slightly shorter recording when it eventually gets up. But thanks for coming, you two. And watch out for the email in a couple of weeks when we restart in June. I'll say goodbye for now.
Have a great holiday.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kristen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.